Hello and welcome to this edition of Full Circle, brought to you by South Central Louisiana Human Services Authority. I am your host, Keith Whiteside, licensed clinical social worker. Thank you so much for joining us, and we are so very glad and honored to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Gravois. Dr. Gravois, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Keith.
Right.
I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. And so we know that May is Children's Mental Health Awareness Month, and you as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, very glad to have you come on and talk with us a little bit about anxiety and how that relates with children and younger people, because it presents very differently than adults, right?
It does, Keith. And, you know, one thing I want to impress upon you is that, and the viewers, is that anxiety can be very normal and typical and in developmentally appropriate ways. So we see that we all experience anxiety.
Right.
And so it becomes a problem when it's more severe or when it's impairing day-to-day living.
Right.
And again, you mentioned in children, it can look very differently than it does in adults.
Right, so the presentation of that. But I guess the one thing I always wonder is, the prevalence of that, what we're dealing with and what we're seeing. And we've got a slide that kind of lets us talk a little bit about really what we're dealing with. Jay, put that up if you don't mind.
Right, so about 30% of the population of children and adolescents are identified as having an anxiety disorder. And out of that, so many of those children are not receiving treatment. So
wow.
They haven't been diagnosed, they haven't been treated, and it's about 80% of those children. And so bringing awareness to that, I think, is very important in offering families some support and also some knowledge in knowing that there is treatment.
And what to do. And so the other interesting thing, I think, is that people don't know when to do something. People don't know when should I act. And so there's a big difference between having a little anxiety and having an anxiety disorder. Can we talk about the difference a little bit?
Exactly, and you're right. So what I like to tell my families and people who are coming in to get an evaluation is, if you have concerns, it's better to come in, give us a call, let us do an evaluation, and then determine, is this something that is just temperament of the child who's a little bit anxious, or is this something that is in fact a disorder and needs further treatment?
Right. Or further evaluation to see what's needed. And so when in doubt, go see the doctor. Call South Central, schedule an appointment. It's very easy to do, and be able to figure out what can be done. And again, just if we have those questions, and like we kind of talked a little bit about, COVID kind of created some of these increased anxieties that maybe we didn't see before, and so did Ida. And some of those things are external that have created some problems. Some children respond a little bit better, some respond differently. But sometimes there's a real issue there. It could be some simple trigger, or it could be something a little more complex.
And that's a great point, because you mentioned external.
Okay.
And oftentimes there are external triggers for anxiety, but what we see a lot with anxiety is it's an internalizing disorder. And so oftentimes these children can be shy and quiet and very compliant, eager to please. And so for those looking from the outside, these children seem to be doing just fine. They're not causing disruption.
Right.
And you mentioned COVID and Ida as being potential triggers. And obviously just the isolation with COVID, and making sometimes kids being afraid to go to school or be around people,
Right.
Has contributed to the increase in mental health disorders that we are seeing in children. Mentioning some of the externalizing behaviors that we see. Oftentimes these kids, even though they're not shy or quiet, they keep it all inside, but sometimes children can become angry or irritable,
Right.
or act out on those behaviors.
Right. And again, some of these things that we see on the screen, just, how they may have trouble connecting, or they get upset or angry more quickly than they used to. And just being able to pick up on some of those. So some great ways to kind of help people see how anxiety may manifest itself, right?
Right. And so for kids and adolescents struggling with anxiety, a lot of times they're just fearful. They're intensely worried about things. It can present, though, with physical complaints, stomach aches or headaches
Right.
or bodily aches and pains. It can also present as specific fears or phobias. So, again, kind of touching on what's developmentally appropriate, we see toddlers who may be afraid of the dark. And again, that's a developmentally appropriate fear that we see kids go through.
Right.
Or even things like storms and their health. It becomes more problematic when that fear, it persists
Right.
past the normal developmental stage, or if it becomes very impairing. So it's affecting their day-to-day functioning. Not being able to go to school or not being able to be away from their families.
So the impact in their daily lives is one of those factors, and when we see severity. So those two things that kind of can identify as, okay, this seems to be like it wasn't a big deal, but now it seems to be more severe, and now it's impacting what they can or can't do. So some wonderful information. I appreciate that very much. And so we're almost out of time here already. And so, Dr. Bravo, we thank you so very much for what you do each day. We thank you for your dedication to our community and to South Central. And Jay, if we have that number, I want to put that up in case people have any questions where they can reach out to South Central Louisiana Human Services. And that's it right there as we close. Doctor, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank
we
you,
appreciate
Keith.
it.
I appreciate you.
Yes, ma'am.